This is my true story. I thought my son was gone forever. I stood in the back row of his funeral, surrounded by strangers, listening to words that tore me apart. They called him a good man, a kind soul, a tragedy. I believed every tear, every prayer. For weeks, I mourned him in silence, until one morning, I saw his face online, alive. That moment changed everything. Before I tell you what really happened, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe, because this story is nothing like you've ever heard before. Grief has a sound. It's not crying or shouting. It's the sound of silence when you realize no one will ever answer your call again. That night, when the phone rang, I thought it was just another evening check-in. Instead, a stranger's voice told me the words no parent is ever ready to hear. There's been an accident. My heart stopped before my mind understood. The world outside my window blurred, and everything I'd built my life around, my purpose, my love, my only child, vanished into that single word. Accident. For hours, I sat in the dark, unable to move. The clock ticked, mocking me with its calm rhythm, as if time could still exist when my world had ended. I remembered his first steps, his first words, the way he used to run into my arms after school. I thought of his laughter, the kind that filled a house with life. It didn't seem possible that such warmth could be replaced by the cold word, gone. The days that followed felt like a fog. People came and went, faces blurring into one another, voices speaking words of comfort that meant nothing. My body was there, but my spirit was wandering somewhere between disbelief and agony. When the authorities brought me his personal items, his watch, his wallet, and a phone cracked down the middle, I held them like fragile proof of existence. They said he'd been driving late, that the car went off the road, that there wasn't much left. I didn't ask for details. Some truths are too cruel to see. When the funeral was arranged, I insisted it be simple. No grand gestures, no speeches from people who barely knew him. But when I arrived, the church was filled with mourners, co-workers, neighbors, old school friends. They all spoke about him like they'd known the man I'd raised. I wanted to feel pride, but all I felt was emptiness. I stood in the back row, my hands trembling, unable to walk closer to the coffin. The priest's words echoed around me, but I heard only my own heartbeat, slow and heavy. Every face in that room looked toward the front, but I couldn't. I couldn't look at the box that held what I thought was my son. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear away the curtain of death and find him laughing somewhere. But grief locks you in place. It's not dramatic. It's paralyzing. My knees nearly gave out as the final prayer ended. People lined up to offer condolences, hands on my shoulder, words like, "He's in a better place." Better than with me? The thought made my chest ache. After the service, I stayed behind when everyone left. I stood near the door, staring at the candles flickering at the altar. The air smelled of wax and flowers, but beneath it all was the scent of loss, something heavy, almost physical. The caretaker approached, gently reminding me they had to close the church. I nodded, but my feet refused to move. That was my first night as a father without a son. The silence in my house that evening was unbearable. Every sound, the creak of the chair, the hum of the refrigerator, felt like a cruel reminder that life continued, even when yours had stopped. I sat by the window and looked out into the street. People walked by, laughing, talking, carrying groceries, checking phones. How could the world still spin? How could laughter exist when my heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces? I wanted to hate them for their normalcy. But instead, I just felt smaller, like I'd been left behind by life itself. I spent the next few days going through his things. His closet smelled faintly of his cologne, his shoes still by the door, his handwriting still on the calendar, reminders of how recent everything had been. I found his notebooks from school, some old letters I'd written to him when he first moved away for work. I read them again and again, trying to hold on to the version of him that I understood. The boy who promised to call every week, the one who said he'd never forget where he came from. The nights were the worst. I would wake up thinking I heard his voice. I would walk to his room, half expecting to find him sitting at the desk or scrolling through his phone. Each time, reality would hit harder. An empty bed, a quiet room, a life that had ended too soon. Sometimes I'd talk to his photo, whispering into the darkness, asking questions that would never be answered. Were you in pain? Did you think of me? Why did it have to be you? As the days turned into weeks, I tried to function, to eat, to sleep, to move. But grief doesn't leave quietly. It follows you everywhere. In the supermarket, I found myself buying his favorite snacks without realizing. In the park, I'd glance at passing faces, thinking I saw him for a moment before reality corrected me. My mind couldn't accept what my eyes had seen: a coffin being lowered, a crowd crying, a goodbye that felt incomplete. There was one moment I remember vividly. I sat in the backyard, watching the wind move through the old tree we planted together. He was 7 when we planted it, small, stubborn, full of energy. He'd said, "One day this tree will be taller than both of us." He was right. It towered now, strong and alive, while he was gone. I touched its bark and felt my chest tighten. The world doesn't stop for anyone. People told me to move on, to accept that he was in peace. But how do you move on from a piece of yourself? I didn't need peace. I needed answers. The funeral had felt too clean, too rushed, the details too vague. The car was destroyed, they said, yet no one showed me the wreck. I was told not to look, that it would only make things worse. But wasn't the worst already done? I started having dreams, strange, vivid ones. In them, I'd see him walking away from me on a crowded street. I'd call out, but he never turned around. Once, I dreamed I followed him through alleys and into a marketplace I didn't recognize. He turned a corner, and when I caught up, he was gone. The next morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, but with a strange feeling, like the dream wasn't fiction. The grief changed me. I stopped answering phone calls. I stopped opening mail. I barely ate. But one thing I couldn't stop doing was looking at his photo. It was framed on the shelf, the one taken on his last birthday. Every morning, I'd look at it and whisper, "I hope you're somewhere good." It became my ritual, my way of surviving the unbearable weight of his absence. Then came the day that would change everything. I woke up, made my usual cup of tea, and sat down with my phone, the same routine I'd followed since he was gone. A notification popped up. A friend I hadn't spoken to in years had posted travel photos. Normally, I'd scroll past. But that morning, something caught my eye. A face in the background of one of those photos. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Grief often does that. But the more I looked, the harder my heart pounded. The photo was taken in another country, a busy marketplace filled with colors and strangers. But there, near a fruit stand, half turned toward the camera, was a face I knew better than my own. My son's. The morning of the funeral felt unreal, like a dream stitched together from grief and disbelief. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I remember standing at the window for a long time before leaving, staring at the emptiness outside. There was no sound. Not even the birds dared to sing. My suit felt heavier than usual, and every button I fastened seemed like a nail sealing something permanent. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to see proof of what I already feared was true. When I reached the church, people were already gathered outside. Their voices blended into a soft murmur, the sound of sympathy mixed with curiosity. I could feel their eyes on me, full of pity. They greeted me with gentle nods and half smiles, but I couldn't find the strength to respond. My hands trembled as I walked through the doors. The scent of flowers filled the air, sweet yet suffocating. White lilies, his favorite, lined the aisle. Each petal felt like a piece of him, fragile and fading. I chose a spot in the back row. I couldn't bear to sit near the front, couldn't bear to see what lay inside that polished wooden box. The coffin was surrounded by candles and photographs, smiling faces from a life that now felt like fiction. One picture showed him as a boy, sitting on my shoulders during a summer fair. Another was from his graduation, the day he said, "You'll always be proud of me, Dad." I had been proud, so proud. But now, pride was just another word that hurt to remember. The service began with music, a soft piano piece he used to play when he visited. My chest tightened with each note. The pastor spoke of faith, of destiny, of how some lives burn bright but short. His words floated in the air, but I couldn't absorb them. My mind wandered to all the moments we'd shared, the fishing trips, the arguments, the laughter over late dinners. Each memory twisted the knife deeper. People took turns standing at the podium. Friends, co-workers, people from his office. Each spoke about how kind he was, how he'd helped them, how his death had shocked everyone. I wanted to be comforted by their words, but instead I felt a strange detachment, as if they were describing someone else. I kept waiting for him to walk in, late as usual, apologizing for the delay. Every time the door opened, my heart jumped and fell again. When they called for family to come forward, I stayed seated. My legs wouldn't move. My hands clutched the bench so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I could see the faces near the front, my cousins, his old friends, all wiping tears. But I couldn't cry. My grief had gone beyond tears. It was an ache too deep, too vast for sound. I had raised that boy, held him when he was sick, taught him to ride a bike, to shave, to stand tall. And now I stood at the edge of his life, watching strangers say goodbye to a man who still lived inside my heart. At one point, someone placed their hand gently on my shoulder. I turned and saw an old family friend. His eyes were red, his voice low. He said something kind, something about strength and time healing all wounds. I nodded, but I wanted to ask him, "Does time bring back the dead? Because if it didn't, what good was it?" As the ceremony ended, they began to carry the coffin out. The sound of wood scraping softly against metal rails sent shivers through me. I followed from afar, unable to get close. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, soft, steady, almost merciful. People opened umbrellas, their black shapes moving like shadows. I watched as they lowered the coffin into the ground. The priest's voice faded into the wind. I felt hollow. When the first handful of soil hit the coffin, I turned away. I couldn't bear it. Someone asked if I wanted to say a few words. I shook my head. What was left to say? The world had taken him, and words couldn't bring him back. I stayed there long after everyone had gone, standing under the drizzle. The cemetery was quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping against the leaves. The flowers on his grave began to wilt before my eyes, their colors fading into the gray. It felt symbolic, everything beautiful turning to ash too soon. I remember staring at the headstone for a long time. His name was carved into it, along with the dates that framed his short life. The finality of it struck me like lightning. Those numbers, 2 small dates, represented everything he'd ever been, everything he'd ever done. I wanted to scream, to tear the stone apart, to demand that someone explain why the world could be so cruel. But all I did was kneel. My knees sank into the wet ground, and for the first time since the call, I let the tears come. They fell hard and fast, mingling with the rain until I couldn't tell which was which. When I finally stood up, I was drenched, cold, and exhausted. The cemetery was empty now. I walked back to my car slowly, my shoes sinking into the mud. Every step felt heavy, like walking through memories I couldn't escape. When I reached the car, I sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, unable to turn the key. The seat beside me was empty, but I could almost feel him there, the way he used to sit when we went for drives, tapping along to the music, always talking about his plans. Now there were no more plans, no more music, just silence. The drive home was a blur. The road stretched endlessly, lights blurring into streaks through the rain. I don't even remember parking or walking inside. I just remember collapsing into my chair, staring at the clock until morning. The minutes passed, but I didn't move. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. My body was there, but my mind was buried with him. The days after the funeral felt unreal. People called, sent food, visited, all trying to comfort me. But what do you say to a man who's lost his only child? They'd talk about faith, about memories, about strength, but none of it mattered. I stopped answering the door. I stopped picking up calls. I wanted to be alone with my pain. The world outside moved on, but mine had ended. One night, I found myself back at the cemetery. It was late, the sky moonless, the air thick with fog. I brought fresh flowers, not because I believed he could see them, but because it made me feel closer to him. I sat beside the grave for hours, speaking in my head, imagining his voice, answering back. The ground was damp, the air cold, but I stayed until dawn. That morning, as the first light broke through the clouds, I realized something strange. Despite the ceremony, despite the burial, something inside me refused to believe he was gone. It wasn't denial. It was instinct. A quiet voice that whispered, "This doesn't feel right." I pushed it away, convincing myself it was grief. But even as I walked home, soaked and shivering, that whisper stayed. In the following weeks, I began to notice small inconsistencies, details that didn't fit. The police report had gaps. The insurance company sent a letter addressed to him, not me. His office refused to release certain documents, saying the case was pending. I brushed it all off as bureaucratic confusion. After all, death brings paperwork. But somewhere deep down, that small voice grew louder. Still, at that time, I had no reason to question reality. My son was dead. I had seen the coffin, the grave, the people crying. I had felt the loss consume every corner of my heart. And yet, as the days turned to weeks, I began to feel something else rising beneath the grief. Not hope, but suspicion. A shadow of doubt that I couldn't yet name. But for that one day, that funeral day, I truly believed he was gone. I stood in the back row of that church, watching my world crumble quietly, unaware that I was mourning a man who hadn't died at all. The weeks after the funeral moved like ghosts, silent, heavy, and endless. Each day felt like walking through fog, with no beginning or end. Morning light didn't comfort me anymore. It just reminded me that I had to survive another day without him. The house was still full of his things, but it no longer felt alive. His shoes by the door, his jacket on the chair, his toothbrush in the bathroom. Everything sat in place, mocking the emptiness that had taken over. I tried to keep busy, but every task turned into a reminder. When I made coffee, I caught myself setting out 2 cups instead of 1. When I cooked dinner, I served extra portions by instinct, forgetting that no one else was coming. The silence of the house was so loud that I sometimes left the radio playing just to pretend someone was there. Even then, it felt hollow. The walls didn't echo warmth anymore. They just repeated my loneliness back to me. Sleep became my enemy. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, waiting for exhaustion to take me. But even when I slept, there was no peace. My dreams were filled with him, laughing, talking, walking through the door like nothing had happened. Sometimes in those dreams, I would hug him and feel his heartbeat, real and strong. But the moment I woke up, reality hit harder than before. The empty bed, the quiet house, all of it reminded me that the dreams were just cruel tricks of the mind. I started to forget what day it was. Meals lost meaning. Nights and mornings blurred into one long stretch of grief. Friends called, neighbors visited, but I couldn't bear to see anyone. What could they say that would make it better? He's in a better place. At least he didn't suffer. None of it mattered. Every word of comfort sounded like noise against the silence in my chest. The hardest moments were the small ones, when I'd hear footsteps outside and think it was him, or when the phone rang and my heart skipped a beat. For a split second, I would hope it was his voice on the other end. It never was. Hope became a cruel joke I couldn't stop telling myself. I found myself sitting by the window most evenings, staring at the streetlights flickering in the distance. I used to imagine him walking home after work, tired but smiling, waving at me through the gate. Now the street was empty, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had felt lonely too, if his last moments had been dark and cold, or if he'd thought of me before he died. That question haunted me more than anything else. Sometimes I caught myself talking to him out loud. I'd ask if he was at peace, if he forgave me for not protecting him, if he knew how much I missed him. Then I'd stop and feel foolish, realizing I was talking to the air. But grief doesn't care about reason. It bends reality until even the impossible feels possible. I visited his grave every Sunday. The cemetery was always quiet, the air still. I'd bring fresh flowers and talk to him the way I used to when he was alive. I'd tell him about the weather, the neighbors, the small things that didn't matter. It made me feel connected, even if only for a while. But each visit ended the same way. Me standing there, tears slipping down my face, whispering goodbye again and again, as if repetition could undo fate. The world outside moved on faster than I could handle. Shops reopened, people laughed, holidays came and went. I couldn't understand how life kept spinning when mine had stopped. The loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical. My chest ached constantly, a dull pressure that wouldn't fade. The doctor called it anxiety, I called it grief. Pills couldn't fix what was broken inside me. There were days I didn't leave the house at all. I'd sit in the same chair for hours, staring at the old family photos. The ones where we were all smiling, unaware of what the future held. I studied his face in every picture, memorizing every line, every detail. I was terrified of forgetting him, the sound of his voice, the way he said "Dad," the way his laughter filled the room. I replayed our last conversation 1,000 times in my mind, trying to find something I could have done differently. But the past is unchangeable, and regret is a heavy chain. People say grief gets lighter with time, but they lie. Time doesn't heal, it just teaches you to carry the weight better. Each day, I carried it like a stone in my chest, pretending to function while breaking slowly inside. I stopped answering the door. I stopped going to church. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted my son back. A month after the funeral, I received mail addressed to him. A bank statement. At first, I thought it was an error. I opened it, expecting it to show a zero balance. The account should have been closed. But instead, I saw transactions. New ones. Dates after his supposed death. My heart raced. Maybe it was a delay, I told myself. Maybe the system hadn't updated. But deep down, something stirred. That night, I sat at my desk and went through everything. The death certificate, the insurance letters, the police report. Each document felt more distant than the last, as if it had been written about someone else entirely. I found inconsistencies, signatures that didn't look right, a medical report that lacked details, but I pushed the thoughts away. Denial is easier than doubt when you're clinging to what little piece you have left. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave. I started noticing how everyone avoided talking about the accident. His friends said they didn't know much. The police officer who'd handled the report refused to give clear answers. Even the insurance company seemed reluctant to share information. Every time I asked questions, I was met with vague responses and sympathetic smiles. It was as if everyone had decided that I didn't need to know more, that an old man should just accept loss quietly. So, I tried. I tried to accept it. I tried to move forward. I started volunteering at the community center, helping other elders with errands. I told myself it would give me purpose. But no matter what I did, the ache followed me. Every face I saw, every laugh I heard, reminded me of him. Then, one morning, everything changed. I was scrolling through social media, something I rarely did. My hands were shaky, my eyes tired. I almost didn't see it. A photo, posted by a distant acquaintance traveling abroad. It showed a crowded street market, full of colors and life. People smiling, carrying bags, eating food under the bright sun. And there, standing casually in the background, unaware of the camera, was him, my son. I froze. My fingers tightened around the phone. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I zoomed in, blinking, hoping I was mistaken. But there was no mistake. The same height, the same posture, The same scar above his eyebrow. The one he got as a child when he fell off his bike. He was alive. Alive and walking freely somewhere halfway across the world. I dropped the phone, my body trembling. My mind couldn't process what my eyes had just seen. For a long moment, I sat there, staring at nothing, breathing shallowly. Then, slowly, something inside me shifted. The grief that had buried me for weeks cracked open, replaced by something sharper. Not anger, not relief, something in between. A hunger for the truth. The emptiness of the past weeks suddenly made sense. The vague reports, the unanswered questions, the strange paperwork, all of it. He wasn't gone. He had made himself disappear. And now that I knew, I wasn't going to let the lie rest. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I woke up with the same heavy silence, made the same lonely breakfast, and sat by the same window I'd stared out of for weeks. The grief had turned into a dull routine. Every day predictable, every hour soaked in emptiness. The only light in the room came from the small lamp on the table, casting long shadows over old photographs. My son's smile stared back at me from one of them. I reached for it, ran my hand over the glass, and whispered a quiet prayer, as I did every morning. I had no idea that by the end of that day, the world I thought I knew would collapse all over again. But this time, not from loss, but from truth. I sat down with my tea and opened my phone out of habit. I wasn't really interested in anything online anymore, but scrolling gave my hands something to do. The first few posts were just noise, people sharing their meals, their travels, their laughter. I barely noticed them until a picture made my heart stop. It was a simple photo, a busy market street filled with color, movement, and sunlight. But there, behind the chaos of fruit stalls and people, stood a familiar figure. A man in a plain white shirt, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a drink. His face wasn't even in full view, but I didn't need a clear shot to recognize him. I'd know that posture anywhere. I'd know that walk, that build, that quiet confidence. My son. I blinked, leaned closer to the screen. My pulse quickened. No, it couldn't be. My mind must have been tricking me. Grief could do that, make you see what you wanted. I zoomed in. The image pixelated, but details emerged. The same watch I'd given him for his 30th birthday, silver band, tiny scratch on the clasp. The same small birthmark just above his jawline, barely visible unless you looked closely. The same shoulders, slightly slanted from an old sports injury. My hand began to tremble. My breath caught in my chest. There was no mistake. The man in that picture was my son. Alive. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. My heart raced so fast it felt like it might burst. My mind spun in every direction at once. How? Why? When? I stared at the timestamp on the post. It had been uploaded just 3 days ago. 3 days. A full month after I had buried him. I scrolled to see the location tag. A small coastal city in another country, far from where we lived. My eyes filled with tears that weren't from sadness this time. My grief turned into confusion, disbelief, and then slowly, something darker. Realization. I looked again at the photo, tracing his outline with my finger. He was smiling. Smiling. The same smile I'd thought I'd never see again. The one I'd cried over at his grave. My head dropped into my hands as memories of that funeral came flooding back. The coffin, the tears, the eulogies. Had it all been a lie? Had I stood over an empty box? Had I buried my faith, my sanity, over a performance? The thought made my stomach twist. I told myself it was impossible. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was someone who just looked like him. Maybe the post was old. Maybe my mind was clinging to ghosts. I opened the image again, searching for proof of error. Something, anything that could convince me I was mistaken. But no matter how many times I looked, it was him. The tilt of his head, the small scar on his wrist, the way his shirt sleeves were always rolled halfway, all of it screamed truth. I spent hours at the table, just staring at that image. The tea went cold. The sun moved across the window, and still I sat frozen, trapped between horror and hope. Eventually, I looked up the account that had posted it. It belonged to an old acquaintance, one of his university friends, a man who traveled often for work. The caption under the photo read, "Great day at the market. Beautiful weather." Nothing about my son, nothing that hinted he even knew the man was in the picture. That meant my son hadn't been traveling with him. He had just been caught accidentally in the background. That made it worse, proof that my son was alive, living freely, not even hiding particularly well. As the reality sank in, I felt my grief mutate into something sharper. Not rage exactly, more like a cold, focused clarity. He wasn't dead. He had made himself dead. He had let me believe it. He had watched me mourn, watched the world bury him, and stayed silent. Why? Money? Crime? Fear? Whatever the reason, one thing became clear. He had chosen lies over truth, escape over family, survival over loyalty. My hands tightened into fists, not from anger, but from something more controlled, determination. That night, I didn't sleep. I printed the photo and pinned it to the wall beside his framed portrait. Two versions of him, one dead, one alive, staring back at me. I studied them for hours, comparing, connecting dots, trying to understand. Somewhere in the early hours of morning, I realized what I had to do. If he was alive, I needed to know why. I needed answers, not to punish, but to reclaim my peace. I had spent weeks grieving a lie, and I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life living under it. The next morning, I reached out to the acquaintance who had posted the photo. I crafted my message carefully, pretending casual curiosity. I thanked him for his post, said the market looked lovely, and asked which city it was taken in. Within minutes, he replied, "Oh, that was in Lisbon." Great place to visit, Lisbon. My mind repeated the word over and over. My son had never mentioned going there. He'd never even shown interest in Europe. I asked nothing more. Too many questions would raise suspicion. But now I had a place, a starting point. I dug through old files, found my passport, and counted my savings. I didn't have much, but I had enough. Over the next few days, I planned everything quietly. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not family. I couldn't risk being talked out of it. Everyone thought I was too fragile to travel, too broken to function. They would never understand that this wasn't grief anymore. This was justice, not revenge, but truth reclaimed. Still, doubt haunted me. What if it wasn't him? What if I traveled across the world only to find a stranger who happened to look like my son? But then I'd look at the photo again, zooming in on his wrist, where the old leather bracelet I'd given him years ago still rested. That was proof enough. My son was alive, and he had faked everything. In the days leading up to my flight, I prepared like a man on a mission. I packed lightly, just essentials, my passport, and a copy of every document related to his death. I wanted to be ready for whatever I found. Each paper I tucked into my bag felt like a fragment of truth that had been stolen from me. I printed out the obituary, the death certificate, the insurance letter, all proof that the world had declared him gone, while he walked under a foreign sun, smiling. The night before I left, I stood outside on the porch, looking at the stars. The air was cold, crisp. I thought about him, the little boy who used to run through these fields, laughing, his small hand holding mine. I thought about the man he became, ambitious, distant, busy. Somewhere between those two versions, I had lost him, or maybe he had lost himself. But whatever the case, I was about to find him again. When morning came, I locked the door behind me, uncertain if I'd ever return. The taxi arrived early. As it pulled away, I glanced once more at the house, at the life that had been built on love and shattered by deceit. It wasn't just about finding him anymore. It was about finding myself, the man who had been buried under lies and sorrow. At the airport, I moved like a ghost among the crowds. People laughed, hurried, checked their phones, unaware that an old man among them was about to chase the truth across an ocean. When the plane took off, I closed my eyes and whispered a silent prayer. I wasn't chasing hope anymore. I was chasing reality, no matter how painful it turned out to be. When I landed in Lisbon, the city felt both alive and distant, as though I had stepped into someone else's dream. The sunlight glared off cobblestones, the streets hummed with chatter, but I moved through it all like a ghost carrying a secret. My suitcase felt lighter than my thoughts. My mind was split, one half clinging to logic, the other drowning in disbelief. Every step I took whispered the same question: what if I'm wrong? I had built my life around facts, around what I could see and touch. I had stood at my son's grave. I had read his name carved into cold stone. I had heard the priest say, "Ashes to ashes." What kind of father questions death after burying his own blood? The thought haunted me, made me feel foolish. Perhaps my grief had become madness. Perhaps I was chasing an illusion born from loneliness. Yet deep down, something stronger than reason pushed me forward, a quiet pull that whispered, "Truth doesn't hide forever." I checked into a small guest house near the market from the photo. The room was simple: white walls, thin curtains, and a bed that creaked every time I breathed. I sat by the window, staring at the street below. Somewhere out there, in this same city, my son might be walking, breathing, living a lie. The idea both terrified and fueled me. I wanted to see him again, to grab him, to demand answers. But another part of me wasn't sure I could handle what I might find. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts ran like wild dogs, biting at the edges of my sanity. I imagined every possibility. Maybe he had been forced into hiding. Maybe he'd staged his death to protect someone. Or maybe, and this thought chilled me, he had done it willingly, without remorse, leaving me to grieve for a ghost. Each explanation twisted inside me, tightening like a noose. By morning, I convinced myself that I needed proof beyond a photo. I walked to the market where the picture had been taken. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts and salt from the nearby sea. Stalls stretched down narrow lanes, filled with colors, oranges, scarves, handmade trinkets. People laughed, bargained, shouted. Life pulsed everywhere, so vibrant that I almost forgot why I was there until I saw it. The same corner, the same fruit stand, the same mural in the background. My breath caught. This was it, the exact spot from the picture. I stood there frozen, scanning every face. Every man of similar build made my heart jump. A stranger's laugh felt like an echo of his. The longer I searched, the more foolish I felt. I walked the streets for hours, watching, waiting, hoping for a glimpse of something impossible. The sun burned into my neck, the crowd pressed close, and still, nothing. My mind began to split again, between hope and exhaustion, between certainty and fear. That night, I returned to the guest house defeated. I sat on the bed, staring at the printed photo like it was mocking me. Maybe I was wrong after all. Maybe the man in the picture was just a look-alike. Maybe I had spent my savings, my sanity, chasing a phantom. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to block the image from my mind. But then I remembered the small details: the scar, the bracelet, the watch. Coincidences don't pile up like that. The truth was still out there, just beyond reach. I spent the next week retracing steps, following whispers of familiarity. I visited banks, cafes, and hostels, asking careful questions in broken Portuguese. I carried his old photo with me, showing it to vendors and drivers. Most shrugged. Some said they'd seen someone like him. One old man at a tobacco shop paused too long before answering. "Yes," he said finally, pointing down the road. "Tall man, quiet eyes. Comes here sometimes." My heart skipped. "When?" I asked. "A few days ago." It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough. That night, I couldn't sit still. I paced the small room until the floorboards groaned. Every sound from the street below made me rush to the window. But doubt crept in again. If he was alive, why hadn't he called me? Why hadn't he reached out? Could a son truly watch his father suffer like that? What kind of man fakes his own death and lets his family bury him? The next morning, I decided to stop looking blindly and start thinking like him. My son had always been methodical, strategic. If he faked his death, he had help. That meant money, papers, contacts. I visited an embassy to inquire about local registries. The clerk, polite but firm, told me such information was private. Still, her eyes flickered when she saw his name on my note. A small hesitation, almost unnoticeable. It confirmed what my heart already knew. I wasn't chasing a shadow. The days blurred together. My body moved automatically, but my mind lived in a constant storm of denial and doubt. I would wake up believing he was alive, and by nightfall, convince myself it was delusion. I stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. The line between faith and obsession thinned until it vanished completely. One evening, I walked down to the harbor, watching the sunset paint the water gold. I imagined him there, standing by the railings, looking out at the same horizon. I tried to imagine what kind of pain or fear could drive a man to erase himself from the world. Maybe he was running from danger. Maybe he thought disappearing would protect me. I wanted to believe that. It was easier to think of him as a misguided son than a cruel liar. But the next day shattered that small comfort. I found another clue. Not by accident, but by persistence. A taxi driver recognized the face in the photo. "Yes, that man," he said. "He lives near the old docks. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Pays in cash." His tone was casual, but my heart erupted inside my chest. It was confirmation, undeniable, final. I walked back to the guest house in silence, the city blurring around me. For the first time, doubt began to fade, replaced by a steady, chilling certainty. My son was alive. He hadn't been forced into hiding. He had chosen it. And tomorrow, I would find him. That night, I sat by the window until dawn, watching lights flicker across the city. My thoughts were heavy but clear. I no longer felt torn between denial and belief. The truth was a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Not because it healed, but because it had cut too deep to feel anymore. I took out his photo one last time and placed it beside my passport. Tomorrow, I would walk into that part of the city and see him with my own eyes. Not the man in a coffin. Not the memory. The real, living man who had traded his father's tears for freedom. And for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not peacefully, but with purpose. The morning I began my search, Lisbon was just waking up. The streets were damp from the night rain, and the air smelled faintly of salt and diesel from the harbor. I moved slowly through the market district, my old shoes tapping against stone. Every sound seemed louder than usual, every voice, every step, as if the city itself knew I was chasing a ghost. I didn't rush. I couldn't. After everything, patience had become my only armor. I stopped at small cafes, showing the same photo over and over again. "Have you seen this man?" Some shook their heads immediately, others studied it for a moment before shrugging. Each time, hope flickered and faded like a weak flame. Still, I continued. I told myself that I had already lived through the worst, burying my son once. Whatever I found now couldn't hurt more than that. By midday, I reached the older part of town near the docks, narrow lanes where buildings leaned toward each other like tired old men. Fishermen shouted in Portuguese, hauling nets full of silver fish. The smell of the sea mixed with coffee and damp rope. I stopped at a kiosk and bought a newspaper, pretending to read while watching faces in the crowd. And then, I saw him again. Not in person, not yet, but on the back page of the paper. It wasn't a feature, just a blurry photo from a community event, a group of volunteers posing by a food stall. Among them, half hidden behind another man, stood a face I knew better than my own reflection. My son. The caption named the event, the charity, the district. My pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place. He wasn't hiding in shadows. He was living quietly, perhaps under a different name. I folded the paper carefully and walked to the address listed for the charity office. It was a small, plain building with peeling paint and an old wooden door. I hesitated outside, rehearsing what to say. I couldn't reveal too much. Not yet. Inside, a young woman greeted me with a polite smile. I told her I was looking for a friend who might have volunteered recently. When I showed her the newspaper, her expression changed slightly. "Oh, him," she said softly. "He's not here anymore. He helped for a few weeks, then left." "Do you know where he went?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She thought for a moment, then pointed toward the harbor. "He worked odd jobs around there. Quiet man, kept to himself." I thanked her and left, heart pounding. The harbor again. Everything pointed back there. The sea had always drawn him. Even as a boy, he'd stand at the shore for hours, staring at the waves, saying it made him feel free. Maybe that was why he'd come here, to start over where no one knew his name. By afternoon, I reached the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil. Ships rocked gently, ropes creaked, and gulls screamed above. I walked past warehouses and boatyards, scanning every face. At a small bar near the pier, I stopped for water. The bartender, an older man with sharp eyes, noticed the picture I kept folded in my hand. "You're looking for someone," he said in accented English. I nodded and showed him the photo. He studied it for a while, then looked at me. "Yes," he said slowly. "He comes here sometimes. Quiet, pays cash, drinks coffee, not beer." He pointed toward a nearby alley. "Lives down there. Small apartment, blue door." My throat went dry. I thanked him, finished my drink, and walked in the direction he'd shown me. The alley was narrow and shaded, the walls covered in graffiti. At the end of it, there it was, a blue door, worn and chipped, with a small brass number above it. I stood there for a long time, unable to move. My legs trembled, my mind screamed for courage. Every possible outcome flashed before me: reunion, rejection, confrontation. But one thing was certain: I had come too far to turn back. I knocked once, lightly. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I waited, listening for movement. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps from inside, cautious, hesitant. The door opened just a crack. My heart stopped. Through the narrow gap, I saw his eyes. The same eyes I'd seen close in a coffin. For a moment, neither of us breathed. The door shut again, fast. Silence. Then footsteps, moving away. I called his name, softly, almost pleading, but the sound died in the damp air. I waited, but he didn't return. I stepped back and leaned against the wall, dizzy. He was alive. There was no denying it now. But he wasn't ready to face me. I didn't chase him, not yet. I needed proof, solid, legal proof. I returned to my guest house and wrote down everything: addresses, names, times, places. I made copies of the photos, printed the newspaper image, and saved digital backups. If my son had faked his death, there would be records, false documents, transfers, insurance payouts. I had to gather them before confronting him again. The next few days became a quiet investigation. I visited local authorities, posed as a retired man handling old paperwork. I asked about death certificates, international transfers, insurance claims. Most offices refused details, but one clerk, an older gentleman, took pity. When I mentioned my son's name, he frowned and searched his files. "Strange," he murmured. "There was a request for verification a few months ago, but it was canceled." He closed the folder quickly, clearly uncomfortable. That one word, canceled, was enough. My son's death had been reported, but not finalized in some systems. Someone had built a web of lies, but not carefully enough. Each discovery fueled my resolve. I returned to the alley every evening, waiting near the blue door. Sometimes I saw movement inside, shadows, the flicker of a lamp. Once, I even heard him speaking on the phone, his voice low and steady. I couldn't catch the words, but the tone was familiar, the same calm voice that used to soothe me after long days of work. Now, it belonged to a man living behind lies. On the fourth evening, I saw him leave. He wore a cap and simple clothes, carrying a bag slung over his shoulder. I followed at a distance through winding streets, careful not to be seen. He walked to a cafe near the square, ordered coffee, and sat by the window. I stood outside, hidden by a tree, watching. For half an hour, I simply watched him exist, alive, unaware of the storm he had left behind. It was surreal. I wanted to rush in, to shout, to demand an explanation. But I stayed still. I needed control. Emotion would ruin everything. When he left, I followed again, this time to a small office building. Through the glass, I saw him speak briefly with a man, hand over an envelope, and leave. The sign on the door read, Maritime Employment Agency. I waited until he was gone, then stepped inside. The receptionist looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. I showed her his photo. "Yes," she said. "He works on cargo ships. Leaves for weeks at a time." She shrugged. "Nice man. Always quiet." I thanked her and left, my head spinning. So that was it. He had built a new life, a new name, a new story. While I mourned, he was sailing freely across oceans. The realization felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But beneath the pain was something colder. Resolve. I couldn't let him keep living that lie. That night, I gathered all my notes and documents. I compiled a small folder of evidence, photos, statements, addresses. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it, but I knew one thing. The truth was now undeniable. My son hadn't died. He had orchestrated a disappearance, defrauded the system, and abandoned his family for freedom. The next step would be confrontation, not of emotion, but of fact. If the world had buried him under lies, then I would be the one to dig him up again, this time in the light of truth. And as I turned off the lamp and lay back on the bed, one thought circled my mind like a storm. A father can forgive mistakes, but he cannot forgive being made to mourn for a man who still breathes. The morning of the reunion began like every other since I'd arrived in Lisbon, with the sea breeze pushing through cracked windows and the low hum of the harbor calling me awake. But this morning was different. I could feel it in my bones. It was the same weight I'd felt the day I buried him, only now it wasn't grief that filled me. It was purpose. The city was waking up slowly, and I knew somewhere among its streets, the man who once called me father was living under a stolen sky. I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but intention. I wore the same old jacket he'd bought me years ago, before life had turned into a lie. My hands trembled slightly as I buttoned it, the way they had trembled when I placed flowers on his coffin. I folded the documents, the photos, and the death certificate into a small leather folder. Proof that the dead don't stay buried when truth calls them back. The cafe near the harbor had become my watchtower. From there, I had seen him before, walking freely, laughing, blending into a life built on deception. That morning, I returned to the same spot. The owner recognized me, nodded silently, and poured coffee without asking. I sat by the window, eyes fixed on the street, heart steady but cold. The wait stretched endlessly, the clock ticking like a drumbeat in my chest. Then, through the morning crowd, I saw him. He walked like he always did, confident but quiet, a man who thought no one was watching. He wore a simple shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and the same leather bracelet on his wrist. My throat tightened. There was no mistaking him. My son, alive, whole, laughing softly at something on his phone. I watched, frozen, as he crossed the street and entered a small grocery store. My mind screamed with emotion, anger, sorrow, disbelief. But my body stayed still. I waited until he came out again, a bag of bread in his hand, and began walking toward the pier. That was when I stood up. Every muscle in my body felt heavy, but I forced my legs to move. The closer I got, the louder the world seemed. Footsteps, wind, gulls crying overhead. He was just a few steps away when I called his name softly. He stopped. The air seemed to freeze between us. Slowly, he turned. Our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us breathed. He looked older, leaner, but those eyes, those same eyes that had once looked up to me as a boy, were filled with something I couldn't read. Shock, guilt, maybe even fear. My voice caught in my throat, but I managed a whisper that barely broke the air. "You buried me too, didn't you?" He dropped the bag in his hand. The bread rolled onto the cobblestones. His lips parted, but no words came. He took a step back, then forward, as if caught between fight and flight. His hands trembled. "You're—" he began, but stopped. I just stood there, unmoving, every emotion I'd buried now standing beside me like ghosts. He turned, glancing around nervously, then motioned toward a quieter street. I followed, not out of forgiveness, but out of finality. I needed to see this through. We stopped in an empty alley behind the store, away from eyes and ears. The air was thick. He looked at me like a man seeing his own past, returned to claim him. "I can explain," he said finally, voice shaking. I said nothing. I didn't need explanations. I needed truth. He started talking fast, words spilling out like confessions torn from guilt. He told me about debts, about dangerous people he owed money to. He said the accident had been staged, a deal, a favor, a desperate escape. He said disappearing was the only way to survive, but every word sounded smaller than the act itself. I stood silent, watching his mouth move, remembering the day I had touched his coffin with trembling fingers, believing my son was gone forever. When he finished, silence filled the space between us. He waited for me to speak, but I couldn't. My voice was trapped under years of trust and heartbreak. He stepped closer, eyes wet, hands shaking. "I wanted to come back," he whispered, "but I couldn't." Still, I said nothing. I pulled the folder from my jacket and handed it to him. Inside were the papers, his death certificate, the insurance records, the documents that proved the lie he'd built. He opened it, scanning the pages, his face draining of color. "How did you—" "I didn't bury a son," I said finally, my voice low but steady. "I buried my belief in one." He tried to speak again, but I raised a hand. I didn't want words anymore. I wanted him to feel the silence he'd left me with. The years I'd spent talking to an empty room, mourning someone who was never gone, the months of pitying glances, the endless condolences that now meant nothing. A gust of wind swept through the alley, lifting a few pages from his hands. He didn't chase them, he just stood there, frozen, eyes glistening. For the first time, I saw fear in him, not fear of death, but of truth. I turned to walk away, but then behind me, I heard him whisper something so faint it almost vanished in the air. "I'm sorry, Dad." I didn't turn around. Sorry was a word for mistakes, not for burial lies. Sorry couldn't undo funerals or bring back the trust he had burned to ashes. I walked back toward the street, each step heavy but certain. People passed me, unaware that a man had just met his son from the grave. When I reached the main road, I stopped and looked back one last time. He was still standing there, shoulders slumped, holding the crumpled papers like a man holding his own guilt. I knew then that this was not the end of his punishment. His punishment would be living with the knowledge that the man he betrayed had risen from the grief he caused, stronger than before. I went straight to the local police that afternoon. Calmly, methodically, I handed over the folder, explained what I had found, and showed them proof of the fraud. They listened, eyes wide with disbelief. One officer asked, "Are you certain it's him?" I nodded. A father always knows. They took copies of the documents and thanked me for coming forward. "We'll investigate," one said gently. I didn't wait for the outcome. I had already done what I came to do. I had found the truth. I had faced the living ghost that had stolen my peace. That night, I returned to my room and sat by the window, staring at the lights of the harbor. I felt no triumph, no joy, just quiet. A peace that didn't heal, but settled. Somewhere out there, he was still free, for now. But the truth was already working its way through the world. Lies decay faster than love. As I drifted to sleep, the city outside hummed softly, indifferent to my story. I had come to Lisbon searching for proof, and I had found it, not in documents, but in his eyes. Eyes that couldn't lie anymore, not when they saw the man they had buried standing before them. The days that followed our encounter felt unreal. I moved through them like a man half awake, carrying both the weight of revelation and the strange lightness of closure. I had spent months mourning, questioning, unraveling my sanity, and now the truth was standing solid before me, breathing, guilty, unmasked. My son was alive. But what lay beneath that fact was darker, more complex than death itself. The lie was no accident. It was architecture, designed, layered, and profitable. The authorities worked quickly. Within days, I received a call from an investigator at the local fraud division. They had traced the life insurance claim back to a series of offshore transfers and corporate filings. My son, it turned out, hadn't just faked his death to escape debt. He'd built an entire new life on the ashes of his old one. He had collaborators, men who helped him stage the accident, forge documents, and access the payout. The figure wasn't small. It was enough to build comfort, to erase history, to pretend the past didn't exist. I listened quietly as the officer explained. I didn't interrupt, didn't curse, didn't cry. There were no tears left, just a deep, steady ache that sat behind my ribs. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the world continued as usual. Gulls crying, waves hitting the rocks, the hum of life unbothered. But inside me, something shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was hollow. The kind of emptiness that follows the end of understanding. They asked me to attend the proceedings when the time came. I agreed, though I didn't know why. Perhaps because I wanted to see it end properly. Perhaps because as a father, I needed to watch the full truth unspool before I could let go. When the trial began, the courtroom was quiet. My son stood there, thinner, older, but composed. The charges were read: insurance fraud, document forgery, identity manipulation. He didn't deny them. He stood straight, eyes fixed ahead, as if bracing against the world's judgment. I watched from the same kind of seat I had stood in during his funeral. Distant, unobtrusive, invisible. A spectator to my own loss, once again. The prosecutor laid out the evidence like pieces of a broken clock. Bank transfers traced through shell companies, false witness statements, travel records that placed him in hiding while I was weeping over an empty coffin. Each revelation was like a small cut reopening an old wound. I wanted to close my eyes, but I forced myself to look. I owed the truth that much. When my turn came to speak, I stood up slowly. The courtroom fell silent. I could feel every gaze on me, the old man who had buried a living son. I didn't speak of anger. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told them what it feels like to stand by a grave believing your child is gone, to watch strangers throw dirt on a coffin you think holds your blood, to go home and live with that silence for months, only to find out later it was all a lie. I saw his face tighten, a flicker of emotion breaking through his practiced calm. For a second, his eyes met mine, and I saw something that wasn't guilt. It was shame. Real, human shame. The kind that cracks the surface of arrogance. He looked down, and I knew that whatever punishment came from the court, it would never equal the punishment of that moment, being seen as what he had become. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. Sentence: several years in prison, fines, restitution to the insurance company. The gavel struck and the sound echoed like final thunder. It didn't bring me joy. Justice rarely does. It only brings quiet. As the guards led him away, he looked over his shoulder once, not pleading, not defiant, just searching. Maybe for forgiveness, maybe for understanding. I couldn't give either. I gave him one small nod instead, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. The truth had unfolded. The lies had burned away. The man I had buried was gone for real this time, not in a coffin, but behind bars. After the trial, reporters tried to speak to me, but I refused every question. I didn't want headlines. I didn't want pity. The story was between me and the silence he had left behind. I walked out of the courthouse into sunlight that felt unfamiliar, too bright for what I carried. The city buzzed around me, indifferent. That night, I returned to my hotel room and opened the folder one last time. The papers that once felt like weapons now felt like closure. I tore them quietly, piece by piece, until all that was left was a small pile of fragments, unreadable, harmless, done. I threw them into the bin and sat by the window. The sea stretched endlessly, dark and calm. I thought about him, about the boy who used to run through fields chasing kites, about the man who'd once promised me he'd take care of me when I grew old. I thought about how love can twist into something unrecognizable when greed takes root. And I realized that this was the second funeral I had attended for him. The first for his body, the second for his soul. In the end, truth doesn't resurrect. It simply reveals. It doesn't heal, but it clears the fog. The truth had stripped everything bare, the lies, the excuses, the illusions, and what was left was raw and clean. The next morning, I packed my suitcase and left the city. As the train pulled away from the station, I looked out at the coast, fading in the distance. Somewhere behind those waters was the man my son had become, learning in silence what it means to live with consequences. And somewhere ahead was peace. Not forgiveness, not vengeance, just quiet. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the train steady my breathing. For the first time in months, my thoughts didn't fight each other. I had seen the truth unfold, and in its painful simplicity, I found something like peace, not happiness, but something better, understanding. The months after the trial passed slowly, but they passed. Time, I learned, doesn't heal betrayal. It only teaches you how to carry it quietly. I left Lisbon not as a man escaping, but as a man finished. There was nothing left to prove, no more truth to uncover. The world had seen what my son had done, and justice had played its role. The newspapers wrote small pieces about it for a few days, a bizarre fraud case, a family deception. But they moved on quickly. Only I carried the story, one heartbeat at a time. I rented a small apartment in a coastal village far from the noise of cities. It was a quiet place where fishermen rose before dawn and the streets smelled of salt and bread. No one there knew my name, and that anonymity felt like grace. I would wake each morning to the cry of gulls, brew tea, and watch the sea shift from gray to blue as the sun climbed. The simplicity of routine felt like a balm after so much chaos. At first, the silence felt too large. I would catch myself setting 2 cups on the table instead of 1. I'd pause halfway through a sentence, as if expecting someone to answer from another room. Grief had a habit of replaying itself, even after the truth was known. But slowly, the silence changed its shape. It stopped echoing and began to settle. I started to enjoy the peace, the lack of questions, the small blessings of solitude. Letters arrived sometimes from the insurance company, updates about the restitution process. I never opened them. The money no longer mattered. I had spent my life chasing stability. But in the end, I realized that peace costs less than wealth. The farm I once owned, the investments, the assets, all of it had been built for family. And now that family was gone, those things meant nothing. What mattered now was something simpler. A bed to rest on, food on the table, and the ability to sleep without seeing a coffin in my dreams. One evening, near the end of spring, I went to the shoreline where the fishermen gathered to mend their nets. The air was thick with the smell of seaweed and smoke from small fires. A young man, barely 20, was struggling to untangle a line. I helped him quietly, showing him the knots my father had once taught me. He thanked me with a smile that reminded me painfully of my son's younger face. Before greed, before deceit. I nodded, smiled back, and walked home with a strange calm in my chest. Perhaps that was what life meant now, to keep passing on what was good, even when the person you raised had turned toward darkness. Occasionally, I would receive updates about my son from the lawyer. His case had drawn mild attention because of its oddness. He served his sentence quietly. No appeals, no drama. They said he worked in the prison workshop, kept to himself, never caused trouble. When I first heard that, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Maybe confinement had done what love could not, force him to face his own reflection without lies. One afternoon, I received a letter written in shaky handwriting. The envelope bore no return address, but I knew immediately who it was from. Inside, a single page. No apology, no explanation. Just a few lines. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I think about you every day. When I leave here, I don't know where I'll go, but I hope someday I'll be the kind of man you can speak to again. Thank you for showing up that day. You gave me back reality, even if it broke us both. I folded the letter and placed it inside my old wallet, beside a worn photo of him as a child holding a kite. I didn't reply. Some things didn't need words anymore. The silence between us had already said everything. Seasons passed. The old habits faded. I stopped visiting the courthouse, stopped checking news about his release. I let time move naturally. My hair grew whiter, my hands thinner, but my heart lighter. I started volunteering at a local orphanage, fixing furniture and teaching children how to plant small gardens. They reminded me that innocence still existed somewhere in the world, that betrayal was not the only legacy a father could leave behind. Sometimes at sunset, I'd walk along the beach, the sky burning orange and gold. I would think of the funeral again, not the one I'd attended, but the second one. The courtroom where truth buried deceit. Both had been quiet ceremonies in their own way. Both had ended with me walking away. I never saw him again. When he finished his sentence, I received no letter, no call. Maybe he moved far away. Maybe he tried to rebuild. I didn't seek him out. Love, when poisoned, becomes memory. It shouldn't be fed again. But I prayed for him sometimes, not as a son, but as a man lost in his own choices. Because even when forgiveness is impossible, compassion still survives in the corners of the heart. Years later, on a cold winter evening, I visited the small cemetery near the village. I didn't go there often, but that day, something pulled me. There, among old gravestones and wild grass, I found a fresh one. It bore a name I didn't recognize, but the birth year was the same as his. For a moment, I stood still, unable to breathe. Then I realized it wasn't him, just a stranger. I exhaled and smiled sadly. It struck me that even if I never knew his final resting place, I had already buried what needed to be buried. The pain, the anger, the expectations. That night, back in my small room, I looked at the photo one last time. The same one I had carried since the beginning. A boy with bright eyes, holding a kite in sunlight. I slipped it into a book of prayers and closed it. I didn't need reminders anymore. The truth had done its work. The world had moved on. Life after truth is simple. You wake, you eat, you breathe, you forgive yourself for ever believing people don't change. You realize that not every story ends with reconciliation. Some end with acceptance. And acceptance, though quiet, is powerful. Now, as an old man, I speak softly when I tell this story. Not because time has dulled the pain, but because I've learned that raising your voice doesn't make the truth any louder. The years have taught me that grief, betrayal, and even justice all echo differently once they've settled. My voice has become like the sea I live beside, steady, low, and patient. When I look back now, I don't just see the betrayal. I see the full picture, the child I raised, the man he became, and the father I was through it all. There's a strange kind of peace that comes with knowing you did everything right and still lost something precious. Because then, you stop blaming yourself. You stop asking why. I realize now that the funeral wasn't just for him, it was for the part of me that believed love could fix everything. Standing in that back row, I buried my faith in unconditional trust. When I saw him alive again, I didn't get that faith back. What I got instead was clarity. A painful, necessary clarity. People often think revenge means hurting someone back. But that's not what this story is about. My revenge was quieter. It was truth. The kind of truth that stands without shouting, that destroys lies by existing. I didn't strike him, didn't scream, didn't beg. I simply lived long enough to watch his lies collapse under their own weight. That's the cruelest, purest form of justice life can deliver. I've learned that time doesn't erase betrayal. It simply teaches you how to live beside it. Some nights, I still wake up hearing the funeral hymns. Other nights, I see that photograph again, the one that shattered my understanding of life and death. But then, morning comes, and the sea outside glows gold, and I remember that I survived it. That's enough. Survival becomes its own form of victory when the world tries to bury you in lies. I also learned something else, something I wish I had known earlier. People don't change when you give them everything. They change when they lose what they thought they owned. My son believed he owned my love, my trust, my name, even my death. He learned too late that none of those can be stolen. They can only be given. And once taken for granted, they vanish forever. Sometimes people in the village ask me about my family. I tell them I have a son who lives far away. It's not a lie, not anymore. He lives somewhere in memory, somewhere I can visit without bitterness. That's enough for me. I don't need reconciliation. I don't need closure. Some doors stay closed, not out of anger, but out of protection. I still visit the church every Sunday, though I don't pray the same way I used to. I don't ask for forgiveness or miracles. I thank the universe for truth, for giving me eyes that saw beyond the grave and a heart that endured it. I light a candle, not for him, but for the man I used to be. The man who believed that love alone could keep the world honest. The world, I've learned, isn't honest, but it can still be kind. The children at the orphanage, the fishermen who greet me each morning, the neighbors who share bread without question, they remind me that decency still exists. My life became smaller, but it also became purer. The noise of false love was gone, replaced by the quiet rhythm of peace earned the hard way. When I look out at the horizon now, I think about what he must be doing. Maybe he's trying to start over somewhere new. Maybe he's learned that truth, once buried, always finds a way to rise. Or maybe he's still running from his reflection. Either way, I don't wish him harm. My heart no longer has room for hate, only lessons. The greatest one? That family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by loyalty. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you connected. And when loyalty breaks, even blood turns thin. My son's betrayal didn't end me. It refined me. I became stronger, wiser, and far more deliberate with my love. There's a saying I once heard, truth waits. It never hurries, never hides, never forgets. I used to think truth was something you had to chase, but now I know. It's something you just have to outlast. I did. I outlasted the lie, the grief, the betrayal, even the memory of that coffin. I outlasted the pain, and in doing so, I found something rare. Freedom. If anyone hearing my story takes something from it, let it be this. Silence is not weakness. It's power waiting for the right moment. I could have shouted when I learned of his lies. I could have fought, cursed, or begged. But silence made the truth louder than any noise. Silence made me patient enough to let life do the exposing. Now, when I sit by my window, watching the tide pull away from the shore, I think of all the things I've lost, and how little they matter compared to what I've gained. Peace, perspective, strength. He told the world I was dead. But the irony is, that lie brought me back to life. It woke me up from the illusion that love means loyalty, or that family means safety. It taught me that the heart, no matter how broken, can still beat for itself. If there's a final truth to this story, it's simple. Death isn't always in graves. Sometimes it's in lies. And sometimes, coming back to life doesn't mean breathing again. It means finally seeing the world for what it really is. I buried my son once, and when I found him alive, I buried my love for him instead. And somehow, that second burial set me free.